Welcome back for another installment of Random Theology. So we have discussed divine aseity. We've discussed the doctrine of the Trinity. So please look over those videos if you've yet had a chance to review them. And I would like to discuss this evening what is technically considered a heresy. So it's this idea of partialism. Right. So some of the different models that are offered by philosophers for the doctrine of the Trinity, one of the common objections is this idea of partialism, right? That each divine person is not wholly and entirely who and what God is. And so the common objection is that entails partialism. Now, partialism is not a clearly defined heresy, but Scott Williams has a paper that he is going to publish in the near future, and he argues that the Sixth Ecumenical Council condemned views like Severius of Antioch and I'm butchering it, but it's Babai, Babai the Great, that effectively endorses some form of partialism or a Mereological model of the doctrine of the Trinity. And so I wanted to talk about this. As a Protestant, the Sixth Ecumenical Council is not binding for me, but it still is something that I need to consider in my assessment of all the different models of the doctrine of the Trinity, looking at the metaphysics and what I take to be the best model of the doctrine of the Trinity. So what I want to do now at this point is I want to clearly state the objection and then analyze some of the responses that can be given to this objection. So first point, so partialism. So if you take a Mereological model of the Trinity, like Bill Craig, Dr. William Lane Craig, in his earlier work, in his book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, and also this big, thick book on philosophical theology that was published, I want to say, in the early 2000s. It is edited by Michael Ray and Tom McCall, and it's a $200 or $300 book on the doctrine of the Trinity. And it is addressing philosophical investigations into the metaphysics of the doctrine of the Trinity. And even in that work, Bill Craig goes back and forth with his last name is Snyder. I'm trying to recall what his name is. Fortunately, it escapes me, but Snyder is his last name. And they go back and forth, trying to evaluate Bill Craig's model of the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, as far as I understand, Bill Craig is the one that offers a metaphysical model of the Trinity, which is a Mereological model of the Trinity, where he takes God as the collective, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that makes up the whole divine substance. So for Craig, God is a composite or complex being that is made up of parts. And the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three parts that make up the whole, the Trinity. And so for Craig, God is the three persons. The three persons is God. And I should be more precise here. The Trinity is God, and God is the Trinity. So when we say God, when we're saying God, God refers to the Trinity, the three persons, the collective, right? And then when we say that the Father is God or the Son is God, we are specifying that each person has or I should say that shares the divine nature and possesses all the divine attributes. And therefore, when we say the Father is God, we're using that in a predicative sense, that the Father has the the quality of being God, right? We're saying that the Father is God in the sense that the Father possesses all the great making properties, right? With the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so we could say that the Father is all of what God is, but not all of who God is, right? And we could say the same thing about the Son. The Son is all of what God is, but not all of who God is, right? And we're using language very loosely here, right? Because if you want to press that, then you might end up with a contradiction. Now the question is how is this type of part whole relation between the divine persons for a Mereological model? And Bill Craig recently discussed this with his response to Khalil Andani. And this was recently published by Reasonable Faith in a podcast. And so that might be something to look at. But so we have to understand that for Craig, the Trinity is not like a pie that's divided up. Instead, you have a complex being, and these parts are not like slices of pie. Perhaps there might be a couple different ways of visualizing this. One way is to think of it as you could think of it as like circles that are intertwined in each other, but that can give the impression that the three persons are separable, and that they're not merely are they individuated, that they're distinct, but they're in fact separate. And that's not the Mereological conception. The Mereological conception of the Trinity is that each person is a essential part of the Trinity that makes up the whole Trinity. But each person is not divisible, and the three persons are not divisible from the Trinity, right? And so if you take a confession, for example, like the London Baptist Confession of Faith, when it talks about God, or even the Westminster Confession, it's going to explicitly say that God, let's see here, I'll read here. So this is the first London Confession of Faith of 1646. So this is a Baptist confession. It says, in this divine and infinite being, there is the Father, the Word, referring to the Son, and the Holy Spirit, each having the whole divine essence, yet the essence undivided, all infinite, without any beginning, therefore, but one God, who is not to be divided in nature and being, but distinguished by several peculiar relative properties. Okay, so this idea that the whole divine essence, each person has the whole divine essence. So that would mean that for a Mereological model, that each person possesses all the great nature, all the divine attributes that they share together, right? That is not to say that each person shares the incommunicable property that makes a person within the Trinity. The Father is a unique, distinct divine person, and the Son is a unique, distinct divine person, and therefore they must have an essential feature that is not shareable between each other, right? And this has to be referring to the essence. It can't merely be a relation between each other. And the reason why I say that is because for Trinitarianism, when you think of the divine cognition or the divine knowledge between the three divine persons that they share, each divine person must have a distinct self-knowledge. Each person must have some sort of de re beliefs or mental tokens, or perhaps if we use a different conception, that each person is a distinct subject, has a distinct first person perspective, and yet the three persons share all the divine attributes together. And this would be consistent with John Duns Scotus's view that is outlined by J.T. Passage in his paper. And I don't have the ability to pull it up right now, but I've cited it in the past. right? And it's in reference to Scotus's understanding of Mereology and the Trinity. So for the doctrine of the Trinity, if you take a Mereological model, each divine person is not triune, right? Because to say that each person has the whole divine essence, that's in reference to the great making properties, the essential divine attributes. The three persons share those. And therefore, each person is wholly what God is. But each person is not wholly who God is, right? Because the Father is not triune in and of himself. The Son is not triune in and of himself. And the Holy Spirit is not triune in and of himself. The three persons are the Trinity. They are collectively the Trinity, not distributively the Trinity. In other words, you can't isolate one of the divine persons and say that that person is triune, right? You would have to say that person is, to use the Mereological language, is part of the Trinity, but is not in and of himself the Trinity, right? And so, in other words, the whole possesses the property of triunity, but the parts do not possess the property of triunity, right? Because if they did, then we would have, three trinities, right? And in fact, someone does take up a view like this, tries to defend a view like this, and that's going to be Justin Mooney. He has an interesting paper where he tries to argue that each person is triune in some sense. But for Craig, that's an impossibility. And for Craig, the way to individuate the divine persons is going to be this self-knowledge between the three persons, right? And the metaphysics of the Mereological relations between the three persons, the parts and the whole, instead of the divine processions. Now, some of these issues some objections towards the partialist view is to say, well, then, the three persons are not truly God then. It seems like they are a degraded version of deity, because the three persons are not the three persons are not wholly and entirely who and what God is. It seems like individually they're not. And so Craig has an argument for this, and Brian Leftow, he says that Craig's view entails some type of Plantingian Arianism. Okay, so Arianism is a moniker to describe a degraded or there's some type of degradation of divinity. Like it's lesser than like a demigod, right? It's not fully and entirely God. It's basically what Brian Leftow is charging Craig's view on. And so how can we address this? Well, Craig makes the point that for Trinitarians, we all make these distinctions between the divine essence and the divine persons. So in traditional, like in the Latin tradition, you would distinguish between the substance and the subsistence, right? Or in the Greek tradition, you distinguish between the ousia and the hypostases, right? Or if you use Aristotelian language, you distinguish between the general essence and the individual essences, right, that make up the general essence. And so with these distinctions, if you don't think that the divine persons are numerically identical to the divine substance, and the divine substance is numerically identical to the divine persons, because if you reject that, which I think for a Trinity model, you're going to have to reject that, because if you don't, then what will end up happening is you're going to end up saying contradictory things. You're going to end up in an incoherence, because the divine persons, each divine person is not the whole Trinity, right? Because each divine person is not three persons. And so you need, in other words, each divine person does not possess the property of triunity, right? The Trinity is the collective of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not distributively each divine person. And because of that, all Trinitarian views assume that there is a fundamental, or maybe I shouldn't say fundamental, but there is a clear level between the whole and the, or if we want to use the traditional language, between the substance and the subsistence, or between the whole and the parts, right? If you're going to use a Mereological view. And so these distinctions, if you affirm a divine unity and you deny divine simplicity as numerical identity, then you're going to face this objection of partialism, right? And so how can we address this objection to partialism? Well, we want to discuss this relationship between the whole and the parts. Okay, divine unity is not going to be in danger. It's not jeopardized, because if you have a conception of divine unity that is similar to what Tim O'Connor argues in his paper that I've discussed in the previous streams. So Timothy O'Connor, he has this paper where he argues for 5 different views of the divine nature. And he argues that for a view like Scotus, the divine nature has a divine unity such that the divine properties, the divine parts, if God has parts, are inseparable, and they're inseparable, they're essential, and they're necessary, right? Now, how are they connected, right? And so I actually recently commented on this new paper by Sean Luke. So Sean Luke, he is a YouTuber. His name is Anglican Aesthetic, right? And he published a paper in the journal Theologica recently. October the 4th, 2024, he published a paper called Holy Triune Love, a Reformulation of Divine Simplicity. And I just want to read to some of you, I should say this, I want to read to you some of my comments on this paper, okay? Because I did a quick review, and if you subscribe to my channel, you probably saw my review. It's very short, but I make this point that for Sean Luke's objections to a Mereological understanding of the divine nature, I said that substantial priority, which is articulated in Ross Inman's book and also articulated in Paul M. Gould's work, this idea of substantial priority, which is neo-Aristotelian metaphysics. Okay, this substantial priority would overcome objections against taking a whole substance as the fundamental ground of its parts, properties, or powers. And if you're not familiar with substantial priority, it's this idea that the parts and the whole have a unique relationship between them, such that the parts, they receive their existence and identity from the whole, right? So the whole grounds the parts with substantial priority. And Ross Inman argues for this, and so does Paul M. Gould. And so if you take that view, then what Sean Luke asks, well, then what makes a property divine, right? And I put it this way. I said, what makes a property divine is the relation it has to the property bearer that gives the property its existence and identity. So if God is a composite being, hypothetically, right? If God is a composite being and God has parts and properties, well, what would make God's divine properties divine? Well, God as the property bearer would be the one that gives God's properties their identity and existence, right? And obviously this would be eternal. These would be eternal relations. This would be a necessary, these relations would be necessary and essential, but it makes the point that the property bearer is the one that makes the properties divine, right? And if you want to, each theologian has it, and philosopher has its own understanding of how to clearly define the creator-creature distinction. Now, for John Duns Scotus, which I really like, he says that what distinguishes the creator from the creature, that the creator exists in an infinite mode and the creature exists in a finite mode. Okay? In terms of mode of existence, God is infinite in mode of being, whereas the creature has finite mode of being, right? And that would also be applicable to God's properties or parts, right? And for Scotus, not all of God's parts are infinite, right? He thinks that you have to have some finite parts, specifically those parts that would entail individuation within the doctrine of the Trinity. And we don't have time to go into that, but if you want to see how that would be articulated, look at J.T. Passach's paper when it's John Duns Scotus and Mereology, right? I mean, Mereological fusions. I think that's the title of the paper. But so Craig makes the point that for Brian Leftow, his argument to work, it has to assume that there's only one way to be divine. But for all Trinitarians, they affirm that there's two ways to be divine, namely the substance and the subsistence, right? The general essence and the individual essences that make up the general essence, right? Or the ousia and the hypostases, right? So all Trinitarians affirm that there's two ways to be divine. And if you affirm that there's two ways to be divine, then you must grant that the whole and the parts are equally God, and that there is no denigration, there's no Arianism there. Right? Now, how can we understand that they're wholly and entirely God then? Well, for a Mereological model, they're going to distinguish not grades of divinity, because for Craig, there is no such thing as different grades of divinity. That's absurd. Something is either divine or it's not. It's going to be categorical distinction. It's not going to be in terms of, or I should say it this way, it's a quality categorical quality distinction, not a quantity distinction, right? And that might mean that it entails some type of infinite existence, right? But the point is there's no hierarchy of divinity for Craig, and Craig is just going to simply say that there's equally two ways or two modes of being divine, either a mode of being a substance or the mode of being a subsistence, or the mode of being a part, or excuse me, the mode of being a whole substance, or being part of a substance, right? Or being having, yeah, I make the point clearly here. So with that assumption, then Craig can easily respond to the objection of partialism and just simply say, well, he can make a tu quoque type argument against any Trinitarian that makes that objection. But better than that, Craig can just simply say that under everyone's assumptions, there is two ways to be divine for a Trinitarian. Unless you're a Unitarian that affirms divine simplicity as numerical identity. If you're a Unitarian, then yeah, there's only one way to be divine. Right? But if you're a Trinitarian, there is in fact two ways to be divine, right? You have to make distinctions that require metaphysical grounding between the essence, right, the substance, and the subsistence, right? And these distinctions, these these distinctions will require you to affirm that there is more than one way to be divine, right? Now, those that affirm divine simplicity will quickly say, well, wait a minute. If divine simplicity as numerical identity is true, well, then the way that we distinguish the individuation within the doctrine of the Trinity is they'll say, okay, the divine substance is numerically identical to the divine persons, and the divine persons are numerically identical to the divine substance, but the divine persons are not numerically identical to each other, right? So they're going to make the point that the relations are what distinguish or individuate, not the essence. Now, the problem with that is we want to say that the substance is triune, right? Yes. So we want to make a truth claim about the divine substance, right? But if the divine substance is numerically identical to the divine persons, then the three persons must each be triune as well. But each person is not triune. No, they're not. It's the collective, the three persons as a whole together is the Trinity, right? And we don't want to say that we are grouping the three persons together and the three persons are each numerically identical to the divine substance. And so at that point, then we could say that the divine substance is triune as well, right? Because in other words, we are not merely referring to these relations of origin. We're referring to the divine substance that possesses these relations of origin, right? And so we are making a truth claim about not merely the persons, but also the divine essence, the divine substance, right? Which, if don't take this language incorrectly, but the divine nature gives rise to these. For Scotus, it's going to be emanations, but for Thomas and others, it's going to be subsisting relations that gives rise to these. The divine processions are grounded in the divine substance, right? And so I don't think that divine simplicity is going to circumvent the objection of partialism any more than a Mereological model of the Trinity will. And so I think that partialism as an objection, since we all affirm that there's two ways to be divine, I don't think that the objection holds. And so we should just discard this objection entirely. I don't think that it holds. Now, what about church history, though? Now, if you're a Roman Catholic, like I said, that the Sixth Ecumenical Council, it seems to say that you can't have some form of partialism, right? And so for someone that has a strong doctrine of sacred tradition, then you might not be able to affirm a Mereological model of the Trinity, which is fine, right? But the point of this discussion is just merely to say this, that partialism is an assertion or an argument that under further analysis does not entail the conclusion that it requires that there would be a denigration of deity within God, right? And a Mereological model of the Trinity can be defended, right? And there's one person that has defended it, and I think that you can incorporate additional propositions to that particular model. So in other words, you can affirm a Mereological model, you can affirm constitution relations, you can affirm eternal generation. And I'm thinking of William Hasker here. He seems to be able to incorporate all of these. And then Andrew Kirshner, who I believe did his dissertation in Missouri under Who did he do it under? He did it under, his advisor is someone that has written on the Trinity in the past. Let me see if I can find it here. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Let me pull it up here. I'm sorry. I'm just can't think of it right now. Let's see. What is it? So he did it, his dissertation in Arkansas. My bad. So Arkansas. And let's see what the specific. Let's see here. Let's see. So he did his dissertation in Arkansas. And his actual dissertation, let's see. Let me just pull it up. So Andrew Kirshner, he wrote a paper called, or a dissertation called Will Independent Mereological Trinitarian Monotheism, a defense of the logical coherence of a priori motivation for and a particular model concerning the doctrine of the Trinity. Andrew Kirshner. And his dissertation advisor was Thomas Senior. And so Thomas Senior, he's written on the Trinity. And it's interesting, his arguments in favor of a Mereological model. So take a look at that. And then I've also written a little bit on this because I was curious. I've discussed this with William Hasker via email. So hope this was interesting. If not, it's all right. I pray that you have a great evening. Peace and God bless.